Yes. Take care. Take care.
You not do that.
Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. The founding of Rome is an event wrapped in myth. Lacking a credible historical record, it is impossible to know exactly what led to the establishment of the Eternal City. But we do know the legend the Romans told themselves, and have some idea of the population migrations that took place in central Italy at the time, so we can piece together a general timeline of events. There may be truth wrapped up in the official legend, and there may not, but it is a good story and an important one to know for students of ancient history. It is the story of a refugee Trojan prince and how his great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandsons would be wet nursed by a she-wolf and later found the greatest city of the ancient world. The story of Rome begins with the end of the Trojan War. After Troy was finally sacked by the Greeks, Aeneas, chief lieutenant of Hector, managed to escape with a few followers. They boarded ships and set out into the Mediterranean to find a new home. Their odyssey took them from Asia Minor to the north coast of Africa, where Aeneas managed to sow the seeds of the Three Punic Wars by seducing the Carthaginian queen Dido and then abandoning her. Virgil writes that in the final moments before she committed suicide, Dido cursed the descendants of both to eternal enmity. O my Tyrians, besiege with hate his progeny and all his race to come. Make this your offering to my dust. No love, no pact must be between our peoples. No, but rise up from my bones, avenging spirit. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. After securing an archenemy for Rome, Aeneas sailed to the west coast of Italy, where he and his followers hoped to make a settlement. Arriving in the territory of Laurentum, the Trojans were immediately met by armed locals who tried to drive them off. But their king, Latinus, decided to make peace rather than war with the foreigners and offered his daughter Lavinia to Aeneas, solidifying an alliance. This marriage came as quite a shock to Turnus, prince of the Rutuli, a nearby tribe, because Lavinia had already been pledged to him. Angered by this slap in the face, he led an attack on the combined Trojan and Latin forces. The Rutuli were defeated, but King Latinus was killed in the fighting, leaving Aeneas in control of both the Trojans and the Latins, who were rapidly intermarrying into a single people. Vanquished, Turnus and the Rutuli turned north to the rich and powerful Etruscans for help. The Etruscans were more than willing to lend a hand against the growing menace of the Trojans whose Latins attacked. But Aeneas, in his final act, led the Latins to victory, establishing the Tiber River as the boundary between the Latins and the Etruscans. We should pause the legend here before we get too far and give an account of the political landscape of pre-Roman Italy as historians and archaeologists understand it today. Who were the Latins? Who were the Etruscans? Where did they come from and what sort of lives did they lead? The origin of the Etruscans is debatable. However, DNA evidence points to a migration from Asia Minor, which, if true, offers a context for the legend of Aeneas' arrival from Troy. The Etruscans were the dominant force culturally and politically in the Italian peninsula, and, as we will see, came to dominate Latin territory in the waning years of the Roman kingdom. They had developed cities and a confederal state system long before the Latins, who remained in traditional tribal affiliations until the foundation of Rome, which was the first major settlement in Latin territory that could be called a city. The Etruscans were artists and craftsmen who had set up extensive trading networks that reached all the way to Greece. The trading roads between Etruria and the Greek cities of Magna Graecia in the south ran right through Rome, offering a clue as to the reason for its location. The Latins, in contrast, were simple pastoral herdsmen. Evidence from ancient burial mounds suggests the Latins were descended from Balkan migrants who crossed the Adriatic in prehistory. Mostly shepherds and farmers, they did not have any sort of advanced arts or crafts. What culture they display seems to be little more than a blend of Etruscan and Greek elements. Indeed, nothing about later Roman history suggests the Latins were innovative at all in art, religion, or letters. They excelled at warfare and engineering and administrating, but were merely students of philosophy, never instructors. Their gods, to take one obvious example, are little more than an adaptation of the Greek pantheon, Zeus becoming Jupiter, Hera becoming Juno, and so forth. What bound the Latins together was a common language, distinct from the Etruscan language to the north and the imported Greek of the south. Latin, of course, forms the basis for half the languages in Europe, and its vocabulary still dominates the legal profession. But enough humorless anthropology. After Aeneas died, his young son Ascanius grew to be king. The town built by the Trojan settlers had become too small for the exploding population, and Ascanius led a group east to found a new settlement called Alba Longa, which would become the seat of the growing Latin kingdom. Generation upon generation followed, and the Latins became powerful and secure. The kingship was passed from father to son, until finally it rested upon the head of a man named Numitor. Numitor had a brother named Amulius who coveted the throne and decided to seize power for himself. Numitor was driven from Alba Longa, all his sons were killed, and his daughter, Rea Silvia, was forced to become a vestal virgin to ensure she would bear no children who could threaten Amulius. However, after taking the vows, Rea was the victim of rape and consequently gave birth to twin boys. Rea declared that the god Mars was the father, but to no avail, and, for the crime of allowing herself to be raped, she was thrown in prison. The twins were sent to be drowned in the Tiber. However, the men entrusted with the task found the river flooded and left the boys in the sluggish water rather than slogging their way to the river itself, and when the waters receded, the babies were left alive and well in the reeds. Here, legend states that a she-wolf, coming to the river to quench her thirst, found the babies and offered her teats for them to suckle on. A herdsman came upon the scene and gathered the children up from the wolf who had been gently licking them and took them home with him. Even Livy acknowledges that the story of the wolf is a fable and postulates that it may have arisen because the herdsman's wife was a whore named Wolf. The herdsman and his wife raised the boys, named Romulus and Remus, as their own, and soon they grew to be men. Apparently the boys took a liking to fighting the local brigands who raided the countryside and began taking the fight to the robbers, raiding their camps and stealing from them. The criminals, angered by the theft of their booty, set a trap for the twins. Romulus managed to escape, but Remus was captured. The brigands took Remus to the local landowner, who turned out to be none other than the exiled Numitor, and claimed Remus and his brother had been caught stealing Numitor's cattle and that he should be punished. Numitor was immediately reminded of his twin grandsons and, realizing that they would be the same age as Remus was now, began to suspect that the boys were his blood. Numitor began making inquiries and soon learned the particulars of their upbringing and became convinced that they were his daughter's children. The herdsman, knowing Remus was in Numitor's custody and having himself long suspected that his two boys were of royal blood, decided to tell Romulus the whole story of their discovery by the river. From this, a plan was hatched to return Numitor to the throne. With Romulus leading one group of men and Remus another, they surprised and killed Amulius and brought Numitor back to Alba Longa. Numitor told the story of his brother's treachery and the circumstances of his grandson's birth, and the people shouted unanimous consent that Numitor be king once again. After Numitor became king, Romulus and Remus decided to found a new settlement at the spot where they had been left to drown. There are two accounts of what happened next. One states that trouble arose when the question of who would be senior in the new city was raised. They decided to allow the gods to decide, and each retired to the top of a hill, Romulus the Palatine and Remus the Aventine, to await a sign. Soon enough, 6 vultures landed at the feet of Remus, and when his followers made this known to Romulus, 12 vultures immediately landed at Romulus's feet. A fight broke out, with one side claiming primacy of arrival, and the other claiming primacy of number. In this fight, Remus was killed. The other, more famous story is that Remus, mocking his brother, jumped over the partially completed walls, and Romulus, in a fit of anger, killed him, swearing, "So perish whoever shall overleap my battlements." Either way, Romulus obtained sole power, the city was named for him, and he became its first king. The legendary date of foundation is April the 21st, 753 BC. Did it happen like this? Almost certainly not. After the sack of Rome in 386 BC, most of the early historical record was lost, and with it the specifics we need for an accurate telling of the story. But archaeological evidence seems to support the broader strokes of the legend. Settlements have been found on the Palatine Hill that date from the 800s BC, suggesting that the legendary chronology is at least in the ballpark. The general story of a struggle between the Latin and Etruscan people, ending with ostensible Latin autonomy south of the Tiber, also fits our understanding of the ethnic and cultural landscape of the era. It is doubtful that the site of Rome was chosen because it marked where the twins had been sent to die. More likely an easy river crossing, coupled with the natural defenses offered by the nearby hills, drew settlers to the area. And of course, as already noted, the site lay on the trade road between Etruria and Magna Graecia. Without any real data to draw from, later Roman historians used common mythological elements to construct a conventional founding legend. Indo-European culture produced numerous examples of the divine twin mytheme, including Castor and Pollux and Idas and Lynceus of Thebes. The motif of infant exposure gone wrong crops up in the biographies of both Perseus and Moses. And of course, most will recognize the virgin birth element from Christianity, but tales of miraculous or virgin births have surrounded important legendary and historical figures for millennium. The addition of Aeneas gives Rome a lofty ancestor and connects their city to the Greek civilizations the Romans so admired. However it happened, a settlement was established at the bend in the Tiber. This settlement grew and came to dominate its neighboring communities, then the entire Italian peninsula, then the entire Mediterranean. Next, we will cover Rome's unsavory beginnings, who the first Romans were, whose women they stole to ensure that there would be a second generation of Romans, and whether Romulus, great soldier that he was, died or simply faded away. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Last time, we discussed the events that led up to the birth of Rome, covering the arrival of Aeneas into Italy and the story of the twins, Romulus and Remus. Today, we will cover the remainder of Romulus's life, his questionable morality, and his ultimate disappearance from the world of men. After Romulus founded the city, it became apparent that he would need to attract settlers in order to ensure its survival. To this end, he opened up the city to what could tactfully be described as colorful characters, but, put simply, they were the dregs of society. Fugitives, escaped slaves, debtors, and criminals all flocked to the new town to start fresh, and Romulus welcomed them with open arms. The first order of business in true Roman fashion was to establish an army. Romulus sifted through his new subjects and divided them into able-bodied men of military age and, well, everyone else. Most sources agree that the first legions consisted of 3,000 foot soldiers and 300 cavalry, but accounts differ as to whether there was initially just one legion or whether there were many. Soldiers in those days had to equip themselves, so only well-to-do citizens could enlist, with the richest citizens serving in the cavalry because they were the only ones who could afford horses. This meant that the interests of the army were, in those early days, firmly squared with the interests of the society it defended, at least the middle and upper classes of that society. In later years, the legions were filled with mercenary soldiers, whose interests often diverged from those of the actual citizens of Rome, who had long since given up fighting for themselves. Here the seeds would be sown for civil war, decline, and ultimately destruction. But for now, Rome's army fought for the people, not against them. From the remaining motley assembly of those not called to arms, Romulus created a council of 100 senators to help him govern, either because that number was enough for his purposes, or because there were only 100 men respectable enough to be given such responsibility. The descendants of these men would become the patrician class of later Rome, who would find themselves constantly at odds with the plebeian class, the descendants of the remaining unwashed masses. Rome was now ready to defend and govern itself, but there was just one problem. The new arrivals were almost entirely male. Without any women around, the dream of Rome would die after a single generation. So delegations were sent around to the neighboring communities to ask for intermarriage rights, but wherever they went, they were refused. Fathers did not want their daughters married to the Romans, who, after all, were nothing more than a collection of despicable cast-offs. The Romans resented these rejections, and so Romulus thought up a surefire way to acquire wives for his people. They would steal them. The Romans invited all the neighboring communities to a great festival honoring Neptune. They spared no expense in preparing and promoting the celebration, and on the appointed day, a great crowd filled Rome, including, famously, the Sabines. All was going well and no one suspected a thing, until Romulus suddenly gave a signal, and the men of Rome seized all the visiting women they could capture. The festival was broken up and the parents of the seized women fled the city, cursing the treachery of the Romans. The seized women were naturally horrified at their predicament, but Romulus went to them and claimed that it was their parents who were to blame because they had been too proud to wed their daughters to Roman men. Further, he said, they would all be treated better in Rome than anywhere else because the Roman men would feel obligated to work off the guilt over what they had done. Apparently this mollified the women, but it did nothing for their parents and brothers. Attacks followed in succession from the victimized communities, but each was repelled by Romulus and the Roman forces. Finally, only the Sabines had not yet sought revenge. They waited and planned rather than immediately taking up arms. When the time was right, the Sabines bribed a young girl to let them into the citadel of the city and took it before the Romans could react. Romulus immediately mustered his army and launched a counterattack. A brief battle was joined, but neither side could gain the upper hand. Finally, the Sabine women, daughters of one side and husbands of the other, intervened, throwing themselves between the two, pleading with them to halt. Livy writes, "We are mothers now," they cried. "Our children are your sons, your grandsons. Do not put on them the stain of parricide. If our marriage, if the relationship between you, is hateful to you, turn your hatred against us. We are the cause of strife. On our account our husbands and fathers lie wounded or dead, and we would rather die ourselves than live either widowed or orphaned." Their entreaties moved the opposing armies and peace was made, ultimately joining the Romans and Sabines into one political entity. The abduction episode has lodged itself in the Western imagination, commonly referred to as the rape of the Sabine women. The event has been depicted by countless painters, including Nicolas Poussin, Jean-Paul Rubens, and Pablo Picasso. Jacques-Louis David depicted the conclusion of the story with his intervention of the Sabine women. Anyone who has read Watership Down will remember that the entire second half of the book is taken up with an adventure to secure female rabbits for the new warren, no doubt taking its inspiration from Roman example, although in that case Hazel and his followers were far more ethical in their solution. After the Sabines joined with the Romans, a power-sharing agreement was reached, and Romulus agreed to rule jointly with Cassius, the Sabine king. The newly integrated citizens of the city were divided into three tribes, the first being made of Romans, the second Sabines, and the third the remaining population, mostly of Etruscan origin. 100 leading Sabines were then added to the Senate, doubling in size. Leadership thus established, Romulus formed the first great citizen assembly, the Comitia Curiata. To do so, he divided the tribes further into 10 curiae, naming each one after an abducted Sabine woman, to honor them for their role in the peacemaking. Each curiae cast one collective vote, making for 30 total, and the assembly was tasked with electing various magistrates and enacting routine laws. Thus the original political constitution was settled. The kings reigned supreme, but, from the beginning, both aristocrats and commoners were involved in the legislative and judicial functions of state. It was at this point as well that the legions doubled in size to approximately 6,000 men, a number that would stand for the remainder of the empire. The power-sharing agreement with Cassius lasted all of 5 years. The Sabine king, for whatever reason, assaulted some envoys from Lavinium, and when he later arrived in that city for routine religious services, he was set upon by a mob and killed. Romulus, not seeking war with Lavinia, and no doubt secretly welcoming the death of his rival, did nothing to avenge the death of his co-ruler. The Sabines were outraged, but fear of Romulus's power and his apparently divine mission held their tongues. Romulus now reigned supreme once again. For the next 40 years, the Romans fought continuously against hostile neighbors, usually Etruscan cities in the north. By the time of Romulus's death, he had made the Romans a power to be reckoned with. The details of his passing confirm his status as a mythological figure. One day, seated on the throne, he was reviewing his troops and a storm kicked up. Thunder clapped, and Romulus was enveloped by a cloud. When the storm dissipated, the throne was empty and Romulus was gone. The senators who stood beside him searched, but no trace of Romulus was ever found. Livy notes that Romulus was always more popular with the people than he was with the Senate, and that it is entirely possible he was murdered by the senators who stood beside him. I find it part of Livy's charm that he would go out of his way to offer a more plausible explanation for the death of such an obviously fictitious character. The life of Romulus is a convenient myth. Who founded Rome? Romulus. Where does the name come from? Romulus. Who organized the legions? Romulus. Who divided up the tribes, organized the Senate, and began the Citizens' Assembly? Romulus, Romulus, Romulus. It is possible that the stories grew from the life of a real person, but most likely Romulus was created out of necessity to answer questions later Romans had about their own past. It seems comically naive of the Romans to believe that so much could be owed to a single man, but when we look at our own almost religious veneration of George Washington, it begins to make sense. In 500 years, will historians be reporting that George Washington was born of a cherry tree and had wooden teeth to prove it, that he flew over the Delaware River, defeated the British Army, and designed the Constitution all by himself? It seems crazy, but as time goes by, the subtleties of actual events are compressed into small digestible units. Horatio Gates has already been pushed from the collective consciousness and is known only to historians, but it was his victory at Saratoga, not Washington's, that led the French to support the revolution and thus ensure its success. That story, though, is too complicated. Most Americans don't even know how critical French involvement was, let alone that Washington had little to do with securing it. Washington beat the British. That is the story of the American Revolution. As the years pass, will the name of Madison be lost? Hamilton? Even the great Thomas Jefferson, whose fame is second to none, may yet fall under the juggernaut that is this mythical Washington, as he, like Romulus, becomes the answer to all questions about the founding of America. Countless hands working patiently over years no doubt transformed Rome from a collection of shepherds into a regional power, but their names have been lost and their deeds have been rolled into the biography of a single mythical man. The early days of Rome stand in stark contrast to its later greatness. To say that the mighty empire came from humble roots would be a gross understatement and entirely misleading. I've always found it odd that more was not done to alter the details of Rome's unsavory beginning. Founded by a man who killed his own brother and was raised by a whore, the city's initial inhabitants were thieves, crooks, and beggars. Such an unappealing lot that they could not find a single woman who would have them, they resorted to kidnapping. To protect their ill-gotten wives, they then proceeded to make war on their new in-laws. There is not a single sympathetic figure in the whole bunch. You almost find yourself rooting for the Etruscans to put this rabble down and restore some decency to the world. But alas, the Romans were strong and would not be conquered, even if they were total bastards. And this is the moral of Rome's birth. The Romans won and grew and thrived, not because they were right or good or moral or God's chosen people, but because they were strong and knew how to win in battle. Might may not make right, but it will make 1,000-year civilization. Join me next time as we discuss Romulus' successors to the throne, Rome's religious awakening, and how the kings were finally run out of town. A transcript of this podcast and additional information can be found, as always, at thehistoryofrome.blogspot.com. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Last time we finished with the death of Romulus, first and greatest king of Rome. Today, we will cover his first three successors, who they were, and what roles they played in the evolution of Roman law and society. I call this section the Seven Kings of Rome because common historical nomenclature always refers to the Seven Kings of Rome, so though we will only be talking about three kings, it seemed appropriate to use the phrase as a title, even if it isn't technically accurate. Just remember, there were 7 kings of Rome. Oh, by the way, in reality, there were almost certainly more than 7 kings of Rome. The idea that 7 successive kings could reign for an average of 35 years each stretches credulity. Nowhere else in the history of mankind have 7 monarchs in a row managed such continuous good luck. The stories handed down to us of Numa and Hostilius and Marcius and the Tarquins are no doubt apocryphal, meant to cover the ground between Romulus and the founding of the Republic, while explaining the evolution of the city's culture at the same time. So just remember, even though there weren't really 7 kings of Rome, there were 7 kings of Rome. After Romulus died or disappeared, there was a crisis. Who would lead the Romans now that their first and only king was gone? Trouble arose not just from the question of which particular man would reign, but also from the question of what tribe he would be from. The Sabines, who would suffer the sole rule of Romulus in silence, now wished to see one of their own placed upon the throne. The Romans found this idea preposterous, but the Sabines refused all Roman candidates, and the Romans, in turn, refused all Sabine candidates. To avoid a slip into anarchy, it was decided that each senator, in succession, would reign for a single day, until an acceptable man was found to rule. This was the first instance in Roman history of an interregnum, or period between official sovereigns. A compromise was finally proposed that allowed the Romans to choose whomever they wished, without Sabine veto, as long as the man was a Sabine. The Romans agreed to this and picked a man of universal renown, Numa Pompilius.
Yes.
The Sabines, delighted by the choice, agreed at once, and messengers were sent to Numa to present him with the good news. To the amazement of everyone, however, Numa refused the offer, and it was only after much cajoling that he agreed to take the throne. You see, Numa was a bit of an odd bird. He disdained all luxury and had devoted his life to religious contemplation. He often took long walks alone, and it was believed that on these strolls he conversed with the gods. Not that this concerned anyone. Quite the opposite, it only enhanced his reputation that the gods spoke to him. But still, not exactly a man you usually find at the head of a growing military power. Numa did not even live in Rome. He resided in a nearby town and was, for the most part, put off by the violence and greed of the city. This second king of Rome was the opposite of Romulus in almost every way. Where Romulus was brash, Numa was reserved. Where Romulus was a warrior, Numa was a pacifist. Where Romulus sought glory and fame, Numa sought peace and solitude. Overnight, he changed the trajectory of Rome's march to greatness. When Numa arrived in Rome, he found a warmongering population of brutes who had known 40 years of war, and when he died, he left Rome a population of farmers who had known 40 years of peace. The remarkable transformation was due entirely to Numa's introduction of religion to the city. He turned the people's attention away from the battlefield and towards the heavens. Desiring peace more than anything else, Numa devised complex religious rites to occupy the time of the now demobilized army so they would not grow restless and provoke unnecessary wars. He instilled in the Romans an everlasting fear and awe of the gods, which would last for the remainder of the empire. Numa is credited with the foundation of the most important religious institutions in Rome. He imported the Vestal Virgins and established the laws governing their watch over the eternal flame. He created the office of Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome, who would be responsible for the maintenance of all religious services, and, in an act of remarkable foresight, declined to serve in that role himself, establishing a sovereign religious realm that could not be meddled with by future kings. He believed that later kings would be so caught up in war-making that they would neglect their religious duties and bring the wrath of the gods upon the city. The office of Pontifex Maximus would remain an independent authority until the title was claimed for the emperors by Augustus at the dawn of the Imperium. At the end of the empire, the title was passed to the popes, who hold it to this day, 2,600 years after its inception. Just as Romulus is the answer to all questions about the founding of the city, Numa is the answer to all questions about the origin of religious practices. Who divided regular days from holy days? Numa. Who created the priesthood of Mars? Numa did. The priesthood of Quirinius? Numa. Who built the altar to Jupiter? Numa, of course. In the development of Roman culture, Numa is second only to Romulus in importance, and to some, he was even more important. Machiavelli writes, "And for anyone who considers Roman history carefully, it is clear how much religion helped in the commanding of armies, in inspiring the plebeians, in keeping men good, and in making the wicked feel shame." Thus, if one were to debate about the prince to whom Rome owed the most, I think Numa would sooner obtain the first place. For where there is religion, one can easily introduce arms, but where there are arms, but no religion, the former can only be introduced with difficulty. Perhaps Numa's most famous addition to Rome was the Temple of Janus. The gates of the temple were to remain open while Rome was at war, and be closed in times of peace. For the entirety of Numa's reign, the doors stayed shut, but after his passing, they remained open almost continuously. Numa's dream of peace, it would seem, died with him, and his reign would be an anomaly in Roman history. Of Numa's Rome, Livy writes, "Once Rome's neighbors had considered her no more than an armed camp in their midst, threatening the general peace. Now they came to revere her so profoundly as a community dedicated wholly to worship that the mere thought of offering her violence seemed to them like sacrilege." Numa reigned 43 years and died in 673 BC. The successor to the throne, Tullus Hostilius, did his level best to banish forever this image of Rome as a city of docile farmer priests. Just as Numa was the opposite of Romulus, Tullus was the opposite of Numa. He longed for a return to the martial virtues of Rome. He believed Numa had left the Romans soft and dangerously unprepared for what Tullus saw as inevitable attack from eternally hostile neighbors. The peace of the previous decades could not hold forever, and if Rome was to live, it had to fight. With this in mind, Tullus looked around for a clash that would reinvigorate the warrior spirit of his people, and found it in the place of Romulus's birth. A cattle raiding dispute along the border between Rome and Alba led to mutual recriminations, and for Tullus, this was enough of a pretext and war was declared. He even managed to arrange things so that the Romans looked like the aggrieved party who were being dragged against their will into battle. Armies from both sides advanced on one another, but before the order for full-scale engagement was given, Medius, the leader of the Albans, approached Tullus with an unusual proposal. There was nothing to be gained, the Albans said, in a bloody struggle between two familial people, when the Etruscans sat at both their doorsteps, eagerly awaiting any opportunity to invade. A fight between Alba and Rome would deplete the strength of both victor and vanquished, leaving the door wide open for the Etruscans to make them all slaves. Medius proposed that single combat should decide their quarrel. That way their respective armies could still keep the ambitious Etruscans in check. Tullus agreed reluctantly, seeing the logic of Medius' argument, though it would not be single combat per se that would decide things. Each army's ranks held three brothers, triplets, who were chosen to fight for the fate of their people. This fight between the Roman Herati and the Alban Curiati is an episode, like the rape of the Sabine women, that has found its way into countless works of art and literature, most famously in the Oath of the Herati by Jacques-Louis David, that great lover of antiquity. In front of the opposing armies, the two sets of brothers squared off. The fight was furious, and in quick succession, two of the Romans lay dead. Horatius, the remaining brother, knowing he could not take all three of his enemies at once, ran up a nearby hill, forcing the three Curiati to chase him. As the first neared, Horatius turned abruptly and killed him. The second Alban brother arrived too late to help, and Horatius fought and killed him as well. The third Curiati, weary from the chase and from wounds sustained in the earlier fight, was no match at all upon arrival. He fell to his knees, and Horatius did not fight him so much as execute him, plunging his sword down the poor bastard's throat. The Romans cheered their victory, and the Albans, grumbling at Medius' deal, were forced to withdraw and supplicate themselves to Roman rule. But Medius, aware of how precarious his authority was in the aftermath of this non-defeat to Rome, conspired to release his people from subjugation. He induced Veii, the nearest Etruscan city and, as we will later see, an important early rival of Rome, to attack the Romans. The Albans, Medius said, would be called upon to aid Rome, and he promised that at a decisive moment in the battle, the Albans would desert, leaving the Roman flank unguarded. Veii jumped at the opportunity to crush Rome and attacked immediately. Just as Medius predicted, Tullus called upon the Albans to join the fight, and the armies gathered to do battle. Just as the fight was about to begin, Medius ordered the Albans to withdraw. The Roman soldiers were shocked to see their ally suddenly leaving, but Tullus, thinking quickly, addressed his troops, telling them that it was his plan for the Albans to sneak around behind the enemy. The Romans, heartened, marched into battle with confidence and defeated the Veiites. Back in camp, however, Tullus ordered the arrest of Medius and had him brought before the Roman troops. Tullus then revealed the treachery of the Alban leader and, to the horror of his men, passed, without trial, a sentence of death by dismemberment. Their leader dead, Tullus then ordered the destruction of Alba Longa itself. He ordered the city destroyed and the citizens relocated to Rome, where they would become Romans, forever wiping Alba from the map. Tullus reigned 32 years and died in 642 BC. The return to arms was his lasting legacy, and the incorporation of the Albans was his most important contribution to the growth of the city. Henceforth, Rome's neighbors returned to their view of the city as little more than an armed camp, and worked tirelessly to defeat the Roman menace. Never again would Rome enjoy an extended period of uninterrupted peace, despite the efforts made by Tullus's successor, Ancus Marcius, the grandson of Numa, to bring the population back to its grandfather's vision of peace. Less is known or told about Ancus than any of his predecessors, but we do know that he attempted to follow in the footsteps of his grandfather, but with far less success. Events conspired to force war upon him, and despite his natural proclivities, he accepted his fate and led the Romans into battle. A confederation of Latin communities who chafed under Roman dominance took Ancus' succession as the perfect opportunity to attack, believing they had another Numa on their hands who would be an easy mark. But Ancus accepted the challenge, and the Roman forces, battle-tested by their years under Tullus, routed each in turn. The defeated inhabitants were forced, like the Albans, to abandon their homes and settle in Rome, while Romans were sent to settle the vacated towns. Through this policy, the population of the city swelled, and the surrounding countryside was filled with subjects loyal to Rome. At the outset of the fight with the Latins, Ancus made his most important contribution to Roman society. Dissatisfied with the haphazard way war began between Rome and her enemies, he decided to inject a sacred ritual, introducing something of Numa into the barbarism of armed conflict. A specific formula was proscribed as to how exactly the Romans would declare war on an enemy. Too tedious to spell out here, but it involved sending envoys into enemy territory, announcing the war to the first man met in an official pronouncement, making more official declarations at appointed times, waiting 33 days, and finally throwing a spear into enemy territory, signaling the beginning of hostilities. The entire process may seem a bit overwrought, but it demonstrates the Roman desire to infuse all aspects of life with the rule of law, even if the end result was savage bloodshed. After the campaign against the Latins, Ancus won an important victory against the Veites, gaining control of the Maetian forest and extending Roman territory all the way to the sea. The consequences of this event cannot be overstated. Through Ostia, the port town founded by Ancus at the mouth of the Tiber, all initial Roman forays into the Mediterranean were launched and received. Ancus reigned 24 years and died in 617 BC. At his death, Rome found itself immeasurably strengthened by the addition of countless new citizens, a neighborhood free of enemies, and a port to call its very own. We will leave the story here and pick up next time with the final three kings, the Tarquin dynasty, the last of which would show himself to be such a tyrant that the very idea of monarchy would be hateful to Romans forever after, even forcing the emperors to semantically cloak their activities so as not to be accused of monarchism. As I said earlier, the lives of these kings are apocryphal biographies designed to explain the origin and development of Rome to later Romans. What is mostly being fleshed out in the story of these first kings is the relationship between the two most important pillars of Roman society, war and religion. The warlike Romulus is followed by the religious Numa, who is followed by the warlike Tullus, until finally the two pillars are joined in Ancus, the religious king who is dragged into battle by fate. This interplay is instructive and offers a neat encapsulation of their character. The Romans are a warlike people, tempered by religion, not a religious people forged into warriors. Ultimately, it is war, not prayer, that defines the Romans. Imagine if it had been the opposite, a people founded by a religious pacifist and succeeded by a warrior, who was then succeeded by a pacifist, who was then succeeded by a warrior, dragged by fate into a religious life. It paints a very different picture. The Romans are fighters through and through, though Machiavelli's point is well taken. Without religious tempering, it is doubtful the Romans could have sustained a republic based upon the rule of law, and would have remained an unremarkable tribe of violent barbarians. To sum up, the Romans were soldiers who took oaths seriously, not priests who took swordsmanship seriously. Join me next time as we discuss the last days of the Roman monarchy and what was so bad about Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome, that led the city to transform itself into a republic that lasted for 500 years. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. So far, we have covered 4 of the 7 kings of Rome: Romulus, Numa Pompilius, Tullus Hostilius, and Angus Marcius. Today we will discuss the final 3, the so-called Tarquin dynasty, the father of Tarquinius Priscus, a decent and manipulative king, his adopted son and successor Servius Tullius, and finally his real son Tarquinius Superbus, who usurped his adopted brother and was then himself usurped by a fed-up mob, marking him forever with the infamy of being the last king of Rome. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus was born in Tarquini, one of the 12 cities of Etruria, the son of a Corinthian exile named Demaratus. Tarquin, the name by which history remembers him, was a shrewd businessman who became wealthy, but due to his racially mixed heritage, he was only admitted so far up the Etruscan social and political ladder. Angered at being denied the respect he felt he deserved, he decided to move to Rome, a city famous for offering men a fresh start. In Rome, Tarquin made an immediate splash. He gave lavishly, funding public projects, charities, and anything else that would bring him renown. It did not take long for Tarquin to come to the attention of Angus Marcius, the aging king. In his final years, Angus brought Tarquin into his confidence, leading to a close relationship that resulted in Tarquin ultimately being made guardian of Angus's 2 sons when the king died. Tarquin knew an opportunity when he saw it, and after Angus died, he sent the 2 boys away on a hunting trip. He then lobbied the Senate to hold elections for a new king immediately to avoid any possible threat to the city brought on by the vacuum of leadership. Tarquin had made a lot of friends in the short time he had been in Rome, and his further generosity no doubt convinced any fence-sitters that he was the man for the job. He was selected in a landslide and became the 5th king of Rome. One of his first acts, demonstrating his characteristic shrewdness, was to expand the Senate by another 100 men, bringing their total number to 300. The new senators were wholly obligated to Tarquin for their positions and, predictably, supported him in everything that he did, leaving the Senate little more than a rubber stamp for Tarquin's policies. This could have proven disastrous if Tarquin had been an incompetent or tyrannical leader, but he proved to be a conscientious and able king, both as an administrator and military commander. Soon after his election, Rome found itself at war, again, with some of its Latin neighbors. Tarquin easily routed his opponents and returned to Rome with a great deal of plunder. He decided to celebrate his victory by throwing public games the likes of which had never been seen. But there was no stadium large enough for Tarquin's vision, so he ordered a hippodrome built between the Palatine and Aventine hills. This hippodrome, when completed, would become known as the Circus Maximus, one of the greatest sports venues in the ancient world. It would remain in continuous use for the 1,000-year existence of the empire. Immediately after work began on the Circus Maximus, Rome found itself embroiled in a fight with the remaining independent Sabine communities. They had never gotten over having half their population annexed by the Romans, and now sought to challenge the upstart for control of the region. Tarquin again led the Romans to victory, defeating the Sabines with strategy as well as brute force. Destroying a bridge the Sabines had used to cross into Roman territory, cutting off any escape route, he then smashed them against the river. To celebrate this victory, Tarquin inaugurated one of the most famous of all Roman traditions, the Triumph. Later years would set guidelines for what constituted an official triumph, but the basic parts were put in place by Tarquin. The leader of the victorious army rides into the city on a chariot drawn by 4 horses. The legions follow with prisoners of the vanquished army and all manner of plunder seized from the enemy. To be awarded a triumph was the greatest honor a Roman general could receive. More will be said later about the traditional elements of the triumph, so for now we will simply note for trivia's sake that it was Tarquinius Priscus who celebrated the first one. Right around this time, a fantastic story reached the king. The head of a slave's sleeping child had suddenly burst into flames, though the child remained unhurt and did not wake up. Witnesses testified that they had seen the event with their own eyes, and that the flames only disappeared when the child awoke. Tarquin's wife believed it was an omen of the child's future greatness, and implored the king to adopt him so as to invite destiny into their house and not have it break down their doors. Tarquin agreed, and the child, Servius Tullius, was adopted by the king. He raised the boy as his own, and the omen bore out as the boy grew into a capable leader and eventual heir apparent to the throne. All was progressing nicely for Tarquin, but trouble was brewing. The sons of Ancus had not forgotten how Tarquin denied them their birthright, and resolved to reclaim what they felt was theirs. Knowing they could never get close to the king, the brothers enticed 2 men to do their dirty work for them. The 2 men arrived at the palace and pretended to have a loud quarrel, eventually demanding the king settle their dispute. Tarquin came to see what all the commotion was about and agreed to settle the fight. But as he sat to adjudicate, one of the men pulled out an axe he had hidden in his robe and lodged it in the back of the king's head. Tarquin fell, and the two men attempted to escape, but they were immediately captured. Tarquin's wife, Tanaquil, seeing the severity of the wound, immediately cleared the room and brought Servius Tullus in to help her tend to the king. Over the body, she told Servius that nothing could be done for Tarquin, but that it was imperative the men responsible for the crime should not sit on the throne. She implored Servius to take part in a charade to guarantee that neither of Ancus's sons would ever be king. Throwing open a window and addressing the crowd that had by this time gathered, Tanaquil told them that her husband's wound was only superficial and that the king would be back on his feet soon. In the meantime, she told them to obey Servius, who would act as king until Tarquin could resume his duties. At this point, of course, the king was already dead. Tarquin reigned 37 years and died in 579 BC. Servius performed the duties of king for a time as if he was merely acting in Tarquin's stead, going so far as to reserve judgment in some legal disputes, claiming that he must consult with the king. The sons of Ancus, believing their plot had failed and seeing Servius secure on the throne, went into exile. Not long after the transfer of power, Veii launched an attack on Rome, and Servius marched to meet them. Completely destroying the Viite army, Servius returned to Rome a beloved savior. At this point, clearly in command of the throne, the death of Tarquin was announced. No one questioned Servius's continued reign as king, and the plan hatched by Tanaquil was brought to a successful conclusion. Servius would be the second to last king of Rome, and by all accounts the last good one. He was responsible for the final reconfiguration of Roman society prior to the establishment of the Republic, a reconfiguration that would have a profound effect on the way that Republic would ultimately be governed. Desiring to take stock of the city's resources, wealth, and population, he instituted the first census. Based upon the data he received, he divided landowning Romans, known as Assidui, into 5 classes. Nominally divided by wealth, the idea was to establish who could provide what when war inevitably came knocking. The first class was the richest, able to provide a helmet, round shield, bronze breastplate, leg armor, sword, and spear. The second class provided all the same equipment as the first, save for the breastplate. The third provided the same as the second, but for the leg armor. Only a spear and javelin were required of the fourth class, and the fifth provided merely slings and stones. Sandwiching these classes were the richest of the rich, already separately designated as equites, cavalrymen able to provide horses, and the poorest of the poor, i.e. most of the population, who were exempted from military service. Men aged 18 to 40 from the 5 classes formed the legions, when the need, which was often, arose. The classes did not serve as strictly military functions. They also formed the basis of the new Roman electoral college. The old tribal assembly created by Romulus, the Comitia Curiata, was surpassed by Servius's new Comitia Centuriata. Each of the classes were further divided into centuries which voted in blocks. The centuries, however, were not equal in size. The first class, which was the smallest, was divided into 80 centuries. The second, third, and fourth classes each had 20. The fifth, by far the largest, was composed of 30. The small group of equites were divided into 12 centuries, and the landless masses were granted just 1. Elections being determined by a simple majority, the equites in the first class held between them all the votes they needed to control who would hold office and what policies would be pursued. There was some logic to the wildly skewed voting system. The wealthy shouldered the financial burdens of both state and military, and thus felt entirely justified in their stranglehold on power. The bulk of the population, however, would come to view the system as entirely unjust and would eventually have to take drastic steps for their voices to be heard. Servius's reign was progressing nicely. The Latin communities even contributed funds to build a temple to Diana in Rome, admitting once and for all that Rome was the capital of Latium. However, all was not well. Just as Ancus's sons were the undoing of Tarquin, so would the sons of Tarquin be the undoing of Servius. Servius believed he had covered this obvious threat by marrying his daughters to the 2 Tarquin boys, Lucius and Aruns. But this was not enough for Lucius, who felt he had been tricked out of his rightful succession, though his new wife was non-committal about this alleged injustice. His brother Aruns, who could not have cared one way or the other, found himself married to a woman, Tullia, who resented his lack of ambition and admired Lucius's drive. Tullia further despised her own sister for not supporting an obviously great man in his quest for the throne. Evil took hold of them and, not being particularly creative, they decided to simply kill their unwanted mates so they could be together and pursue the crown at full throttle. The newlyweds began a whisper campaign against Servius, pointing out his low birth and the fact that he had never been truly elected. To the richest in Rome, they alleged that the census was no more than a trick to expose their wealth so Servius could snatch it up and hand it over to his local friends. Lucius grew ever more bold as he gained support, until finally he decided to make his move. He went to the palace while Servius was away and sat upon the throne, demanding that the Senate assemble before him. When they did, out of a mixture of fear and confusion, he demanded they kneel before him and hail him King Tarquin. He was in the midst of a lengthy speech degrading Servius when the old king appeared, demanding an explanation. A scuffle ensued between the supporters of Tarquin and those loyal to Servius, and in the melee, the old king himself was struck and killed. Servius had reigned 43 years and died in 535 BC. Lucius would become known to history as Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud, the last king of Rome. From the start, Tarquin was the very model of a tyrant. He was vain, arrogant, pompous, and dismissive of both the people and the Senate. He built monuments to himself at the expense of the rich, using the labor of the poor. Smart enough to understand his shaky position, having seized power without so much as a nod to electoral formalities, he chose fear as the basis for his reign. He claimed for himself all legislative and judicial functions and dared anyone to oppose him. Those who did quickly regretted their choice. Tarquin arrested, tried, and executed his opponents, completely bypassing the traditional court system. He confiscated property whenever he saw fit and arbitrarily reduced the ranks of the Senate, leaving it anemic and unable to counter his actions. Tarquin's misconduct was not confined to the city itself. He sought to consolidate Rome's power over Latium and to this end called a council of the local nobility. He let them sit all day without making an appearance until one of them rose to declare that Tarquin was making them wait on purpose to show that he could order them around at will. Just then Tarquin finally appeared. The king made note of the man who had spoken against him and, after the meeting broke up, bribed one of the noble slaves to plant a cache of weapons in his master's room. The deed done, Tarquin recalled the council and announced that he had just discovered a plot against his life and fingered the offensive noble as its leader. They marched as a group to where the noble was staying and discovered the hidden weapons. That, coupled with his speech from the day before, was enough to frame the poor man, and he was immediately executed without so much as a trial. The remaining Latin nobility, whether they believed the charges or not, believed that Tarquin was capable of almost anything, and so did nothing to challenge his position in Rome. The city and surrounding countryside thus pacified, Tarquin sat back to enjoy the fruits of his labor. But only poisoned fruit can grow from such poisonous seeds, and Tarquin would soon pay the ultimate price for his underhanded tactics. Tarquin, obviously, had engendered no goodwill in the city, and the population waited only for a spark to light them into full revolt. Tarquin's own son would provide that spark. The young man, Sextus, was invited to a dinner party hosted by Collatinus, a local noble, and upon meeting Lucretia, the lady of the house, Sextus decided that he must have her. Inflamed with lust, he returned to the house while Collatinus was off laying siege to the nearby town of Ardea, and raided her. His lust faded, Sextus rode off unaware of what he had set in motion. Collatinus, riding back to Rome with a certain Lucius Junius Brutus, was met by a messenger who bid him return to his house at once. There, surrounded by her father, Collatinus and Brutus, Lucretia told him what Sextus had done, then, overwhelmed by shame, grabbed a knife and stabbed herself in the heart. The three men, grief-stricken, stood over her body and swore that the Tarquins would pay for her death. Returning at once to the encamped army at Ardea, Brutus raised them into revolt with a stern speech denouncing the Tarquins as oppressive criminals. He then led the army back to Rome, where he planned to expel the Tarquins once and for all. Arriving in the city, he marched through the streets and found a population slaving away on Tarquin's various pet projects and ready for revolution. Tarquin, at this point, having heard of the mutiny in Ardea, had ridden out to take control of the situation, but instead found his army gone and himself in exile from the city he allegedly ruled. Tarquinius Superbus reigned 24 years and would die seeking, but never regaining, the throne. Back in the city, the liberated people declared the Tarquins enemies of the state and forever barred them from Rome. The Comita Centuriata was convened, and it was decided that kings should never again rule Rome, and that two men should be elected annually to be leaders, so that power could never again be concentrated in the hands of a single man. Collatinus and Brutus were duly elected and were inaugurated as the first two consuls in Roman history. The year was 509 BC, and the most famous republic in the history of the world was born. The story of the ill-fated Tarquin dynasty casts an interesting shadow over Roman history. Through the obviously apocryphal royal biographies, a general outline of actual history begins to emerge. As I said in part 1, Roman culture was derived largely from Etruscan and Greek influences, so, as an instructive parallel, we are given the story of a family of kings who became masters of Rome after emigrating from Etruria and were descended from an exiled Greek. There, in the micro story of the Tarquins, is the macro story of all Rome. This dramatic, if fictitious account has roots in reality. Modern historians recognize the dominance Etruria had over Rome until the founding of the Republic. It is thought that Etruscan kings did indeed command Rome, and that they were rejected by a native population wary of their rule. Though the neatness of this account no doubt misses a reality filled with intermarriage and colliding cultures, making it hard to know who was a native Roman and who was a foreign Etruscan. The story of the kings also offers a moral that the Romans followed to great success and abandoned at their peril. Until the ill-fated Tarquinius Superbus, none of the kings had been the son of a previous ruler. Hereditary succession played almost no part in the ascension of the kings. Ancus Marcius was the only one who was even related to one of his predecessors, and he was the grandson of Numa, not an immediate heir. This stands in stark contrast to the monarchies that emerged in the Middle Ages that were founded entirely on the passing of power from father to son, whatever the merits or abilities of the child. Gibbon famously marks the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire, with Marcus Aurelius' sentimental choice of his son Commodus and not another, more capable man to succeed the imperium in 177 AD. The choice ended 5 successive transfers of power from the emperor to a man chosen on merit and not relation. The 100-year period of the so-called 5 good emperors marked the height of Roman power, wealth, and stability. History has shown again and again that the ship of state is well sailed when leadership is based on great ability and run against the rocks when it is based upon mere birth. The Roman monarchy was now dead, never to return. Next, we move on to the story of the Roman Republic and trace its long march through the Italian peninsula, across the Mediterranean, and into legend. Next week we will discuss the first days of the Republic, who its initial leaders were, and what would happen to any man who ever again tried to make himself king of Rome.
Stand down or die.
Hello, and welcome to the history of Rome. It has been 200 years since the founding of Rome, and since that time the Romans had undergone a massive transformation. In the beginning, they were a collection of pastoral herdsmen and unsavory cast-offs making their way in the world by flock and trade, and since that time they had learned to become settled farmers, tilling the land and raising crops. They had gone from being a collection of armed rabble to a society of laws with a well-equipped, well-disciplined army. They had gone from upstart village to regional capital and now stood ready to challenge a wider pool of neighbors for control of all Italy. The Etruscans lay to the north and the Greeks to the south, and having conquered the central lowlands during the reign of the kings, the Romans now turned to the hills and mountains of East Italy for fresh conquest, and, as always, were forced to parry the thrust of the Etruscan cities to the north. This is the world into which the Republic was born. According to the legendary chronology, the kings were overthrown in 509 BC, though the date is highly suspect. Most likely later, patriotic Roman historians changed the timing of the event to slightly predate the establishment of democracy in Athens by Cleisthenes in 508 BC. The Romans had a hard time believing they were not first and best in everything, especially in the democracy they took so much pride in, so they altered their history to outdo the Greeks. However, without any concrete data, it is hard to know exactly when the kings were driven out, so we are forced to mark our own history as if the city was a 509 date. As I said in part 1, the sack of Rome by the Gauls in 389 BC destroyed all primary documentation, so we are left with a mixture of legend and historic conviction. Before we get into the story of the early republic, I want to pause for a moment and establish who exactly we are talking about here. I often say that Rome did this and that the Romans did that, but except for a few passing disambiguations, I have not done much to describe the varying nature of the population. Were they some homogeneous hive mind who agreed on everything and acted with a single will? No, quite the opposite. There were rich Romans and poor Romans and middle-class Romans. There were men and women and children. There were slaves and freed slaves and immigrants and criminals and honest men who worked hard every day and lazy men who did not. There were prostitutes and vestal virgins and intellectuals and illiterates. Just like any society, the city of Rome was inhabited by a vast array of individuals, each with their own worldview, motivation, and dream. And just like in any society, the Romans did not always get along with one another, and, in fact, often fought bitterly with one another for control and freedom from control. When the Republic was founded, the population of Rome was around 130,000. This population was divided into two basic groups, the patricians and the plebes. Put simply, the patricians came from those families who could trace their roots back to the original 100 senators chosen by Romulus, and the plebes came from those that could not. Generally speaking, the distinction between patrician and plebe also followed economic class divisions, though, as we will see, it was never that simple. In the early days, the political weight of the classes was inversely related to their numerical size. The smaller set of patricians held power over the larger set of plebes. As I noted last week, the two richest classes in Rome held between them enough votes to snuff out any possible opposition, and those classes were, for the most part, made up of patricians, so the patricians made the rules. In the beginning, then, the democratic republic was really an oligarchy of wealthy, aristocratic families who shaped policy to serve their interests and who had no intention of ever letting anyone else into the decision-making process. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but let me just say that it did not take long for the plebes, especially those plebes who were wealthy, to demand greater voice in government. This tension between the patricians and the plebes would dominate Roman politics for the duration of the empire. Outside the basic patrician-plebe dichotomy, there were those without even nominal political standing, namely women, slaves, and immigrants. These groups formed a majority in sheer numerical terms, but were denied almost all political rights. Even the plebeian males, who howled righteously at the injustice of being denied a say in government, would have cried just as loud if someone had suggested suffrage being extended to women, or slaves, or immigrants. The idea would have been beyond comprehension. And the contradictions of the early republic bear a striking resemblance to the contradictions of the early United States. When you picture the burgeoning Roman Republic, picture what you know of the burgeoning American Republic. The United States, though rhetorically cloaked in the language of freedom and equality, allowed only white, landowning males to vote. Eventually, the propertyless men agitated against the injustice of an oligarchical elite trampling on their freedoms and earned the same right, but women and blacks and Indians and the new immigrants were left out in the cold, present but unheard. This was Rome, a republic in which the disenfranchised majority were ruled by a disproportionately powerful elite. This, then, was the basic political breakdown of the population. Economically speaking, whether patrician or plebe, the majority of Romans were, by this time, settled farmers. But this was no utopia of land-owning citizen farmers. The land was owned by an elite minority and worked by the rest of the population. Economics and politics coincided just as they do today, and the tension between owner and operator mirrored the tension between patrician and plebe. Plebes were constantly agitating for land redistribution, and patricians blocked reform whenever they could. In this early stage of the empire, the actual work of the farms was still done by the lower-class citizens, slaves being an important part of the Roman economic model, but not yet the keystone upon which the entire system was based. The farms produced two basic products: food for internal consumption, usually grain and cereals, and crops for external trade, usually olives and grapes, and the refined offspring, oil and wine. The Romans, building on the roots already established by the Etruscans, used savvy trade policies to enrich themselves with all manner of foreign goods, establishing a truly international flavor in the city. But as in so many other aspects of Roman society, it was the wealthy patricians who controlled the import-export boards, and it was they who benefited the most from foreign trade. Needless to say, the landless plebe who worked in the fields did not dress in African finery and eat off of Greek silverware. Divisions were many within the population, economically and politically, and hatred abounded between the classes. But, in the end, they were all Romans, and set aside their differences any time the city was threatened, though picking up their rivalries right where they left off when danger had passed. That all being said, it's time to continue with our story. The tyranny of the monarchy had been banished forever. It was decided, and again, when you picture this, feel free to picture the patrician senators and equites hammering out the details, because it was really them making all the early decisions. The lower classes and plebes had nothing to do with it. The two men should rule annually to avoid any single man accumulating too much power. Originally, these men were called praetors, though the title would be changed in the early 300s BC to the more familiar consul. For clarity's sake, I will use the latter designation even for the early executives who were technically praetors, because the office itself did not change, just the name, and, well, most translations of early Roman history refer to them as consuls anyway, so there is no reason to confuse an already confusing situation with a lot of semantic nitpicking. Anyway, to the Roman mind, ensuring freedom was not so much a matter of scaling back or limiting the power of the executive, as the Founding Fathers sought to do with their system of checks and balances, as it was a matter of limiting the length of time within which absolute rule could be wielded. The consuls had all the same powers a king had, near absolute power over war and peace, life and death. They just had to give it up after a year. The second consul was the one check the Romans did add into the system. One consul could veto the actions of the other, and that was that. Any consul who tried to run away with power could be stopped at a word from his colleague. If the two conspired to oppress the people, their terms of office expired after a year, and they were back to being mere citizens, with all the legal weight that would be brought down upon two men who sought to make themselves king. In the end, it was the expiring term of office that really let the Romans sleep well at night. The executive power sharing was merely a useful novelty. In that year, 509 BC, this was as far as the Republic had gone constitutionally. Rather than the Comita Centuriata getting together and electing a king who served for life, they got together and elected two men who served for 1 year. As I said last week, the first two consuls were Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus. The former led the revolt against the king, and the latter's raped wife had sparked the event. Brutus's first act was to make all men swear an oath that they should never again allow a king to rule Rome. As you can see, the legacy of Numa remained a potent force. Brutus felt that a sacred oath before Jupiter would be enough to bind men to oppose monarchy, and, barring a few exceptions, it did. The Romans did not mess around with their oaths. There was, however, an immediate problem. Collatinus, you will note, bore the hated moniker Tarquinius, being a relative of the overthrown king. The population, jittery in their newfound freedom, worried that lust for power was an inborn trait of the Tarquins, and immediately regretted their election of Collatinus, despite the fact that he had helped lead the revolution and vocally denounced his cousins. When pressed, though, Collatinus agreed, for the sake of the stability and viability of the new republic, to resign the consulship, even though everyone agreed it was completely ridiculous to ask him to do so. In his place, another one of the ringleaders of the revolt was elected, Publius Valerius, who will, in a moment, earn the honorarium Publicola, or Friend of the People, for his service to Rome. Students of American history will immediately recognize Publius's name. The Federalist Papers, written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, in defense of the newly written Constitution, appeared in print under the pseudonym Publius in honor of this consul's role in securing Rome's new republic. Publius is often cited as being one of the original consuls of Rome, but we should not forget Collatinus and his selfless resignation in the face of baseless and superficial fears for the sake of his country's freedom. The first threat the new republic faced was the first threat all successful revolutions face, namely, counter-revolution. There were more than a few Romans who had lived just fine under the kings, and were in no mood to lose their privileged place in society. A collection of young nobles, including two sons of the consul Brutus, conspired with envoys of the exiled King Tarquin to betray the city to him and reinstate the monarchy. The plot was revealed by one of the noble's slaves, and the entire group was arrested. Brutus was shocked to see his own sons involved in the affair, but incontrovertible evidence was produced confirming their guilt. The penalty for treason was severe, and despite his tortured misgivings, Brutus would not stop the sentence from being carried out. The young conspirators were tied to a post, scourged, and then beheaded. Brutus's decision was long lauded by the Romans as a patriotic sacrifice, teaching a moral lesson about putting the welfare of the state before even one's own family, but the ruthlessness of the decision often makes it difficult for us to see the nobility of the act. The second threat the new republic faced was the second threat all successful revolutions face, namely, invasion by an opportunistic enemy trying to take advantage of a neophyte central government. Tarquin had by this time taken refuge in Veii and pleaded with the nobility there to aid him in reconquering Rome. He argued that the virus of republicanism might infect Etruria and wipe out all the royal families in the region. The nobles of Veii were indeed worried about their subjects catching the freedom bug and, believing that Rome's leadership would be shaky and disjointed without a strong king in charge, agreed to aid Tarquin and attacked. However, to the surprise and consternation of Tarquin and the Vieites, Brutus and Publius proved to be extremely capable commanders, routing the army from Veii easily. The battle was not without tragedy for the Romans, though. In the middle of the fight, Brutus, liberator of Rome, was killed. His body was borne back to the city, and Rome went into mourning for a full year. Publius now stood alone and, like Collatinus before him, soon fell under suspicion by the fickle and paranoid masses. After the battle with the Vieites, Publius began construction on a home atop the Velia, a ridge jutting from the north side of the Palatine Hill. The people suspected him of making a fortress from which he could safely enslave them all. Publius caught wind of the sentiment and called a mass meeting, shaming the populace for their irrational fears and announcing that if it worried them so much, he would move his home to the bottom of the hill, where they could all keep watch on him.
Far from the slums.
He further used the opportunity provided by the meeting to propose 2 new laws, which made him a hero to the now assuaged masses and earned him the aforementioned title Publicola. The 2 laws are famous even to this day. The first stated that any man who tried to make himself king could be killed at any time by any other man without fear of reprisal. And the second stated that any decision by the magistrate could be appealed to the people's assembly. Publius, content with the single credit he received for these democratic initiatives, then called for an election to fill the open consulship. Marcus Horatius Fulvius was eventually elected after a short detour through a consul who was elected but then died from old age a few days later. And this closed the first year of the Republic. Leadership settled, the people mollified, and Rome secure. In the coming years, the tension between patrician and plebe would dominate public life in Rome, the patricians wary always of runaway mob rule, and the plebes seeing no practical difference between the overthrown king and the newly empowered Senate. Next week, we will jump headlong into this so-called conflict of the orders and witness the plebes voting with their feet and demanding a real voice in the allegedly democratic republic they had all fought so hard to establish and keep. Welcome to the History of Rome. Last week, we discussed the transitional year of 509 BC, when Rome went from being a typical Italian kingdom to an atypical Italian republic. Though the actual workings of the republic were not as democratic as they appeared on the surface, the fact remained that the monarchy had been abolished and annual elections now determined leadership. The first years after the change would prove difficult for the new government, for it faced both internal dissension and external invasion. Those years would see the final defeat of the Tarquins, the resubduing of Latium, and finally the extension of political rights to the plebes with the creation of the office of tribune, the plebeian answer to the patrician consulship. After his Viet army was defeated, the ex-king Tarquin next took refuge in the Etruscan city of Clusium under the protection of its king, Lars Porsena. Tarquin begged Porsena to attack the Romans, repeating his line about the threat democracy posed to royalty everywhere, and the necessity of returning a king to the throne. Porsena, like the Vieites, no doubt took this argument under advisement, but when he agreed to make war with the Romans, he did so ultimately for his own reasons. There are 2 accounts of what happened next. Either Porsena invaded and was successfully repulsed, or he invaded and captured the city. The former is alleged by Roman folktales, the latter is supported by modern historical analysis. According to the legendary tradition, Porsena, in defense of his fellow Etruscan king Tarquin, marched south and was met by the Roman forces at the Tiber. The Romans, seeing the size of the Etruscan army, fled back across the river, leaving the bridge, and therefore the city, unguarded. A single Roman soldier named Horatius, realizing he could not prevent the army's flight, ordered men to set fire to the bridge in order to prevent the Etruscans from crossing and sacking the city. To buy time, he stood alone on the far side of the bridge and challenged the whole of Porsena's army to combat. While the dumbstruck Etruscans tried to figure out what they should do with this crazy brave, but clearly suicidal soldier, the other Romans set fire to the wooden bridge. The Etruscans were finally snapped out of their stupor when the burning bridge collapsed into the river and attacked, but Horatius jumped in the river and swam unscathed to the other side, saving the city and enrolling himself in a pantheon of great Roman heroes. Porsena was forced to initiate a siege, which proved no more effective than his initial assault, again due to the bravery of a single Roman citizen. This time it was Mucius Scaevola, who proved his valor and secured ultimate victory for Rome. The city was suffering under Porsena's siege and showed no signs of being able to fight it off. Mucius, taking matters into his own hand, crossed over to the Etruscan camp. He made his way to Porsena's headquarters and waited for an opportunity to strike. When Porsena's entourage emerged, Mucius attempted to assassinate the king, but, unsure of who his target was, mistakenly attacked one of the king's secretaries. Mucius was seized and dragged before the shaken king. What happened next would be the stuff of Roman legend and a moral story to inspire generation upon generation of future citizens. Mucius told the king that the Romans had declared war not on the men of Clusium, but upon Porsena personally, and that he was merely the first in a long line of assassins who would not stop until the king was dead. The king, unnerved by this idea, ordered Mucius burned alive and found himself only further unnerved by what Mucius did next. The Roman stuck his right hand into the fire and, without flinching, allowed it to burn. He declared that such was the regard Roman men held for their bodies, and that the king should remember what lay in store for him. Porsena was, to say the least, impressed and very freaked out. He allowed Mucius to go free, commending the man for his bravery, and not wishing to live his life under a death sentence from a bunch of psychotic patriot assassins, he made peace with Rome and lifted the siege, never having taken the city. This was the official legend. Other, non-Roman sources tell a different, more plausible story. In this version, Porsena did indeed take Rome in the turbulent years after the founding of the Republic and set up a puppet government. The outcome seems reasonable in that the Etruscans of Clusium would have been much stronger and far better equipped than the Romans were at this point, and resistance would have been futile at best. The reason Porsena, who is a confirmed historical figure, invaded Rome is a further divide between fact and legend. The melodrama of Tarquin's plea for Etruscan solidarity is pure fiction, as is the decisiveness of individual Roman bravery. Population upheaval in Italy around 500 BC had resulted in an estrangement between Etruria and their Greek trading partners in the south. Specifically, Etruscan trade routes were disrupted by the Volscians, a central Italian hill tribe who settled the plains between Etruria and Magna Graecia south of Rome. Porsena's conquest of the Romans was just a step in the greater project of maintaining the safety of the southern trade roads from attack. Disabusing the notion that the war had been waged on Tarquin's behalf, Porsena left his son in charge of matters in Latium after defeating Rome. His son, though, was defeated by an army of allied Latins and driven back north, re-securing independence for Rome as an unintended byproduct. The Latin communities emerged strong from the encounter, and Rome humbled, setting up a major confrontation for control of central Italy that would ultimately see Rome re-emerge as the dominant force in Latium for another 150 years. The Latins had chafed under Roman rule during the reign of the Tarquins, and took the opportunity presented by Rome's weakened position to attempt a redrawing of the political landscape. Disorganized by Porsena's invasion and a lack of internal political unity, Rome seemed easy pickings for the emboldened Latins. But they underestimated Rome's will, a common mistake made by enemies of the empire for years to come. An alliance of Latin communities broke from the Romans and forced the issue into an armed conflict, which they thought would see them master Rome, but instead it led them right back under the yoke. A decisive battle was fought near Lake Regillus, southeast of Rome, and though the details of the fight are unimportant, the Battle of Lake Regillus is important for two reasons. First, as I mentioned, it ended Latin resistance to Rome for another 150 years, until, embroiled in a long war with the Samnites, Rome was again seen as vulnerable enough to resist. Second, it marked the first time that a dictator led a Roman army in battle. The office of dictator was a curious instrument to find within the constitution of a republic, but the Romans felt that extraordinary emergencies called for extraordinary solutions, and dictators were appointed periodically over the years when such emergencies arose. Basically, a dictator was appointed when all the red tape needed to be cut through, and one single man needed to take decisive action now, without complaint or appeal or challenge. According to law, a dictator could be appointed for one 6-month term, at the end of which he would resign and power would revert back to the consuls. At the beginning of his term, the dictator appointed a vice-dictator, called his master of horse, who was accountable to no one but the dictator himself. The Romans were sufficiently distressed by the hostility of the Latins that they used their extraordinary solution for the first time to lead an army against a foreign threat. And technically the first dictator ever appointed had been a man named Titus Lartius, who had served briefly in that position 2 years before to quell internal riots, but beyond trivia, the event is hardly worth mentioning. The appointment of Aulus Postumius, however, was a watershed moment. Lartius's appointment had been a ploy used by the patricians to put the fear of God back into the plebes, which of course it did, but there was never any question of actually instilling him with dictatorial powers for any period of time. Postumius, however, was given the keys to the city and told to do whatever was necessary to defeat the Latins, essentially that he was now a law unto himself. Postumius did indeed lead the army to victory over the Latins, and then, in a remarkable display of constitutional loyalty, stepped down from the heady heights of absolute dictatorship and restored the consuls to their rightful positions. The remarkable giving up of power demonstrates both Postumius's personal honor and the extent to which Rome as a whole probably would have cried out for his murder if he had considered remaining in power. The monarchy really was dead, and though dictators would be appointed off and on for the next 450 years, it was not until Julius Caesar that a dictator did not ultimately resign of his own free will. The Latins reconquered and the dictatorship passed, Rome found itself at peace. And as a general rule, whenever Rome found itself at peace abroad, it immediately found itself divided at home. The question of plebeian rights, never satisfactorily settled, now reared its head once again. The plebes were not to be put off this time. No amount of patrician chicanery and backroom dealing would break their solidarity. Only rights guaranteed by law would satisfy them now. The plebes would ultimately win political concessions from the patricians, though it took the first recorded strike in history to do so. Trouble arose over the matter of debt bonding. In Roman law at the time, if a debtor could not pay his creditor, then he became a bonded servant to the creditor until the debt was repaid. This system of indentured servitude essentially made permanent slaves of the debtors because, while servants to the creditors, they were unable to earn any money to pay off their debts. Many of the soldiers who fought in the recent war against the Latins found themselves bonded in this way. The practice in this case was especially egregious because the debts were incurred while the men were off fighting in patriotic defense of the city. The plebes agitated for debt relief, but were rebuffed by the patricians, whose attitude was basically, you take on the debt, you pay the price. Offended by this high-handed treatment, the plebes were on the verge of full-blown revolt when the city suddenly found itself under attack from all sides. The Sabines, Volscians, and Aquians all began making forays into Roman territory, and the Senate called for armies to be raised. The plebes sensed an opportunity, and when the consuls began calling names for enlistment, not one of them made a move. The Senate was basically beside itself at this mass act of treason and immediately appointed a dictator to smash the resistance. But in an amazing display of moderation and wisdom, they appointed the brother of Publius Publicola, Manlius Valerius, whom the plebes loved, to the office. Valerius begged the plebes to do their duty and enlist, promising that once hostilities were concluded, the issue of debt relief would be addressed straight away. Swayed by Valerius, they relented and legions were formed. In due course, all 3 foreign threats were put down, and the legions returned to Rome. Back in the city, however, Valerius was unable to fulfill his promise. The patrician senators blocked his attempts at debt relief, and Valerius resigned his office, laying at the Senate's feet all domestic turmoil that would ensue as a result of their decision. The disbanded legionaries were outraged at the betrayal and took an extraordinary step that would become known to history as the secession of the plebes. The soldiers marched en masse to the Sacred Mount, a hill 3 miles from Rome, and set up a fortified camp, refusing to return to the city until their demands were met. The population of the city flew into a panic. The remaining plebes feared retaliatory violence from the patricians, and conversely, the patricians feared runaway mob violence without the army around to maintain order. And what they both feared the most was external invasion. If word got out that Rome's army had abandoned her, every two-bit tribe in the neighborhood would come knocking on the city gates, and Rome would be at their mercy. So the Senate relented and sent an envoy to the plebe camp to broker a deal. The settlement did not address the debt question directly. Rather, a new office was created to shield the plebes from future patrician tyranny, the tribunate. The dangerous precedent set by the strike was pointed out to the plebes by the patrician envoy, who compared the republic to a body. It is true, he told them, the hands and feet and mouth could join forces and stop working for the lazy stomach, who sat there greedily receiving all the food the other parts worked for. But if they were to do so, the entire body would soon die of starvation, for the stomach pumped energy back out into the limbs. The plebes would be granted more rights to end the secession, the envoy said, but they must not think, in the future, that starving the stomach was in their enlightened best interest. The plebes took some note of this, but were so absorbed with their success that it is doubtful the lesson fully sank in. The role of tribune was defensive in nature. 2 plebeian men would be elected each year to act as a counterweight to the consuls. Initially, the power of the tribunes was modestly held to the right to free any man from patrician imprisonment, though in the future they would gain the right to veto, literally, I forbid, any law passed by the consuls or the Senate at a word. The tribunes were also granted sacrosanctity, or the right to be free from harm. The plebes took a solemn oath to kill any man who attempted to assault a tribune, and more than once that oath was fulfilled. The tribunate would become a flashpoint for Roman politics for the remainder of the Republic. The eventual power to veto led to a number of showdowns with the patricians, both sides bloodying themselves in their attempts to control state policy. The power of the office would peak with the Gracchi brothers around 125 BC and fall into obsolescence with the ascension of the Caesars. But for the bulk of the Republican period, it was an important and powerful office. The tribunes would be elected by a new assembly called the Comitia Tributa, which would be made up of the now 35 tribes of Rome. Suffrage in the assembly was not based on a property assessment, as it was with the Centuriata, and so the Comitia Tributa was as democratic a forum as Rome would ever see. The secession of the plebes occurred in 494 BC, about 15 years after the birth of the Republic. Though domestic combustion and foreign invasion were constant threats, the Republic had passed through its infancy and emerged as an adolescent power ready for fresh challenges. Any threat posed by the ex-king Tarquin was gone, and monarchy was now firmly in the rearview mirror. The attempted revolt by the Latin communities had been suppressed by a Republican army, and Rome managed to maintain control of Latium just as it had while a monarchy. The patricians and plebes were settled in an alliance, uneasy though it may have been, and the population was more or less at peace with itself. Next week we will cover the creation of the final piece of the Republican puzzle, the Law of the 12 Tables, as well as discuss the rising threat posed by the Volscians, which caused the Romans to make their first concerted forays into the eastern hills, where they would fight the wars that would ultimately win them control of all Italy. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. We ended last week with the plebes finally being granted nominal political rights, or at least defenders within the political arena, with the creation of the office of tribune. This stopped plebeian agitation for a while, but as the years passed, a new generation came of age and demanded further protection from the ever-present threat of patrician tyranny. It was not enough to be protected from an abuse of the law, because, at the time, nobody knew exactly what the law was. The legal framework of Rome was a nebulous body of oral and written traditions, with precedents and subclauses hiding all over the place, in official decrees, letters, pronouncements, and, most dangerously, in the minds of old patrician lawyers. Who was to say a man was being treated unjustly if no one knew exactly what justice was? This new generation of plebeian agitators would ultimately win a great victory for themselves and the rule of law, giving the Romans a set of written precepts that would be memorized by every child and recited by every adult, the 12 tables of Roman law. This official codification of the law occurred around 451 BC, but before we get to that point in our story, I want to give a brief account of what Rome dealt with in the 40-odd years between the inception of the tribunate and the creation of the 12 tables. Internally, Rome was full of tension, but, as I said, for the first 20 years or so, nothing boiled over too much to disrupt the day-to-day, year-to-year operations of the city. The consuls and senate still held the lion's share of the power, though they were now checked somewhat by the tribunes. The Romans were held together by an unceasing series of wars against their neighbors to the north, east, and south. To the north, they fought a particularly hard campaign against their old nemesis, the Veites, that ended in a stalemate in 474 BC, a campaign that came complete with a dressed-up Battle of Thermopylae, with 306 members of the noble Fabii family cast in the role of King Leonidas and his doomed Spartans. Protecting an undefensible pass, the Fabii clan fought to the last man to give the legions a chance to regroup. The battles fought to the east and south were of a different sort, and revolved around a geographically based cultural clash. Veii may have been in competition with Rome, but at least it was a settled city of civilized farmers. Out in the eastern hills, however, nomadic tribes, particularly the Volscians and the Aequians, pressed at Rome's borders. The nomadic herdsmen coveted Rome's soft, flat land and tried every year to carve out some or all of Roman territory and turn it from parceled farms into a massive grazing zone. As a result, the Romans were constantly beating back encroachment by the migrant tribes, who occasionally mustered enough force to give the Romans a run for their money, but were usually dispatched easily. For the first 10 years after the secession of the plebes, and running concurrently with the on-again, off-again battles with Veii, the Volscians posed the greatest danger. They had already made great inroads south of the city, effectively securing all the land between the hills and the sea, blocking trade with Magna Graecia. The peak of the Volscian threat came early, in 491 BC, when a disgruntled Roman general named Coriolanus defected and led a Volscian army through the legions and right to the gates of the city. The Roman men beaten, the women were sent to plead with Coriolanus to end his attack, and it was only after a personal appeal from his own mother that Coriolanus' heart finally turned, and he withdrew the army. His Volscian officers were appalled at being denied their easy victory, and back in Volscian territory, they murdered their Roman leader. It has been noted that the story of Coriolanus bears a striking resemblance to the story of the great Athenian general Themistocles, and that the story was probably inserted later to account for the defeat suffered by Rome at the hands of nomadic rabble. The Roman ego demanded that Romans could only be defeated by other Romans. By the mid-480s BC, though, the Volscian threat had largely been contained, and the city was never seriously threatened again, though the Volscians maintained control over the southern plains for the remainder of the century, and were a constant menace along Rome's borders. Throughout the 470s and 460s BC, even though the external danger had been greatly diminished, the legions still went out every summer campaigning against the latest forays by the Volscians or Aequian raiders. The total military dominance of Rome over the hill tribes eventually led the plebe leaders to suspect that the patricians were not being totally honest with the threat level posed by the tribes. And with the record the Roman army had, it's hard to blame them. Without even breaking a sweat, the legions dispatched every enemy they encountered. A political pattern began to emerge. Plebe leaders would decry the raising of yet another army to go to battle with the Volscians or whoever, even though they posed no serious threat, and would denounce the Senate for starting wars to put off questions of further economic and political reform. These leaders would always, in turn, be denounced by the Senate as self-absorbed traitors who were putting personal ambition ahead of Rome's safety. The plebe leaders would shoot back that the patricians were sending men out to die for no other reason than to tighten their grip on wealth and power. A standoff would ensue, but Rome, being what it was, would ultimately raise the legion, and the plebeian demagogues would be silenced. The Romans were soldiers, and fighting is what they did. Throughout these years, Rome's position vis-a-vis the nomadic herdsmen was never seriously threatened, though in the following century, Rome would fight a knockdown, drag-out war with a rising hill tribe called the Samnites that would ultimately see all Italy eventually fighting on one side or the other. In the years after the secession of the plebes, There were essentially two major initiatives that excited the plebes and kept the patricians up at night. The first was proposed by a tribune named Valero in 473 BC. It stated simply that the tribunes ought to be elected by the tribal assembly and not by the comitia centuriata as they had been in the first years after the office was created. The patricians balked at the idea, knowing full well that they would no longer have undue weight in choosing who would be tribune. As I noted last week, the patricians inevitably failed in their attempt to quash the proposal. An election of the tribunes was duly passed to the comitia tributa. As if this wasn't bad enough, in 462 BC, a tribune named Terentillus made an even more radical proposal. The laws of Rome should be written down and posted so that all citizens would be bound to the same code and no man could rise above them. The patricians were horrified at the thought and spent the next 10 years doing everything in their power to stop its implementation. It was during these years that the plebes really started to resist military service and openly question patrician motives. At one point, however, caught up in their own rhetoric, they failed to believe it when the Senate woke up one morning and announced that during the night, a small Sabine army had penetrated the city and had taken the citadel. It was only after a desperate plea by the consuls that the plebes finally agreed to raise an army, finding much to their surprise that the citadel had in fact been taken and their city was under siege. The legions, along with a contingent of local allies, easily dislodged the Sabines, and the greatest casualty of the whole encounter was what little influence the tribunes had so recently achieved. The patricians, as a result, managed to put off Terentillus' proposal for another 10 years. In the end, though, they were forced to relent. Political consciousness had been raised in the city by travelers from the south who brought with them word of Solon's political reforms in the great Greek city of Athens, causing proponents of reform to beat a steady drum. Finally, a combination of plague, famine, and the economically destabilizing introduction of coins as a medium of exchange in 454 BC led to a crisis of confidence in the leadership, and something had to be done to assuage the masses. It was agreed in 451 BC that consular power for the year would be transferred to a body of 10 men called the Decemvirate, whose main task it would be to collect and condense Roman law into a single uniform code to be published on bronze tablets in the Forum for all to see. Unfortunately, the total contents of the 12 tables, each posted on a separate bronze tablet, hence the name, has been lost to history, and all we have to rely on is occasional excerpts and summaries by later Roman authors. We know generally what topics each table covered, and the range in detail gives a fascinating insight into the Roman mind. Held within the tables, written 2,500 years ago, we find the basis for many of our own founding principles. For example, the ninth table explicitly forbids passage of laws against specific individuals, a principle still in force today, while the first table establishes the sanctity of the subpoena, or the requirement to appear before a court. The tables covered a wide range of matters, from lawsuit procedures to payment of debts, to inheritance rights, to upkeep of public sewers, to divorce and property boundary issues. I will not bore you with a lengthy recitation of the contents of each table, but I do want to highlight some of the more curious facets of the Roman legal mind. For example, according to the eighth table, a thief caught at night may be killed without penalty, but if the same thief is caught during the day, he must be delivered unharmed to the magistrates. Contained within the same table, we discover what the penalty was for throwing an unaimed weapon into a crowd. The accused was fined 1 ram. The seventh table states that fruit that falls from a tree onto a neighbor's property shall be the property of that neighbor, a provision which demonstrates just how scrupulously litigious the Romans could be. Death was the ultimate penalty and was prescribed for a number of crimes, including murder and the destruction of crops, but also, interestingly, for matters involving the integrity of the courts. Magistrates who took bribes to influence their decisions, as well as witnesses who lied under oath, were both ordered flung from a high cliff. To the Romans, perjury was a heinous crime that threatened the entire community. The final provision I want to point out was hidden deep in the ninth table, a piece of fine print that, once discovered, outraged the plebes and led to violent class confrontations. No patrician shall be allowed to marry a plebe. Effectively, this codified a closing off of upward social mobility to the majority of the population and guaranteed that none of them would ever hold the most powerful office of state, the consulship. This did not go over well with the plebes. As I mentioned earlier, the 12 tables were the foundation of later Roman law, and were memorized by all citizens, literate or not. The existence of a written body of law was not a Roman innovation, nor did it make them unique in the ancient world, but it did put them into a select group of states that valued the objectivity of the law over the subjectivity of capricious rulers. The story of the Decemvirs, the magistrates tasked with the compilation, ends with an interesting bit of legendary melodrama. During the year, or two depending on the source, that the Decemvirs were in office, they held ultimate authority. The unbroken chain of consular elections had been broken, and effectively a new form of government had been briefly ushered in. Rather than rule by 2 men, it was rule by 10 men. And among those 10 men, one was first among equals, a man named Appius Claudius. Claudius came from a family of staunch patricians, and was a vigorous opponent of just about any proposed plebeian reform. After finishing their appointed task, the Decemvirate had lost their raison d'etre and was set to disband, but Claudius, enjoying his newfound power, convinced his colleagues that they should remain in office after their term expired. The other Decemvirs, similarly enjoying the trappings of power, agreed, and when the consular elections for that year arrived, the Decemvirate simply did not allow anyone to stand, and no elections were held. The people found themselves unexpectedly in a constitutional crisis. Even though Claudius and the Decemvirs had made a naked power grab, there was no legal avenue available to stop them, for the Decemvirate had been instilled with all judicial authority. Ironically, the body of men who laid down the laws were the first to blatantly ignore them. Days and weeks passed with the Decemvirate maintaining their illegal hold on power, until finally Claudius went too far and the entire city rose up in revolt. Claudius had his eye on a beautiful plebeian girl who was set to be married to a young army officer. Claudius declared out of the blue that the girl in question was an escaped slave owned by one of his clients and that she must be returned. A hearing was called to decide the case, and numerous witnesses were brought up, attesting to the freeborn status of the young woman. But the trial was overseen by Claudius who, to the astonishment of everyone present, ruled that the girl was indeed an escaped slave and was the property of the complaining client, despite obvious evidence to the contrary. The people were appalled at this absurd conclusion, and the army, when it caught wind of the decision, joined in their outrage. The husband-to-be and the father of the woman were both officers in good standing, and the army was incredulous at the arbitrary injustice of Claudius towards one of their own. The people, supported by the army, then used their bargaining chip of last resort and abandoned the city, removing themselves to the sacred mount just as they had done 40 years earlier. The Decemvirs, recognized that their position had become untenable, finally resigned. Claudius was arrested, but rather than face trial, he killed himself. Regular consular elections then took place, and Rome's domestic tranquility was restored. The plebeians actually emerged from the order better off than they had been, for in their negotiations to return to the city, they demanded the number of tribunes be raised to 10, which the Senate, anxious to get things back to normal and again fearing invasion, agreed to. And of course, the codification of the laws, the decades-long plebeian demand, had already been accomplished, leaving them in a much stronger position legally to fend off future patrician tyranny. The creation of the 12 tables left the plebes on the one hand overjoyed, but on the other they were horrified by some of the provisions it contained. True, the rule of law would now dominate patrician subjectivity, but that one sticking point of the illegality of patrician-plebe marriage opened their eyes to an oppression that they never knew existed. Only patricians could be consuls or hold the other high magistracies, including Pontifex Maximus. If no plebe could ever marry a patrician, then no plebe would ever hold high office, and the patricians would always and forever hold the winning political hand. The next cycle of patrician-plebe conflict would revolve around this very issue, eventually leading to a number of reforms that further diluted the patrician stranglehold on power, which we will get to in the weeks ahead. Those of you who know Roman history may have noticed that I ran right by one of the most well-known folk legends, which occurred around 460 BC, without so much as a mention. That is because next week I want to focus in detail on the central figure of that story, the great Cincinnatus, whose career spans both sides of the Decemvirate interlude. Join me next week as we untangle the man from the myth and figure out what made Cincinnatus such a towering figure that American settlers felt compelled to name their new boomtown on the Ohio River after a Roman who had been dead 2,200 years. welcome to the history of Rome. We ended last week in 451 BC with the 12 tables of law written down and the decemvirate expelled. This week I want to step back a few years to focus on the life of one man, Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus, who has passed into the collective memory as a paradigm of republican virtue, even though the decisive moments of his life were almost certainly invented by later historians to embellish his famous career, and, in the end, nothing he did was particularly unprecedented. Still, his biography continues to resonate, and taken by itself, it is a pretty good story of a humble man who had absolute power thrust upon him, and then, remarkably, relinquished that power and returned to his plow. A man who sacrificed everything for the Republic. Cincinnatus was born around 519 BC, when the king still reigned, and was just a boy when Brutus and Collatinus expelled the Tarquins. He was therefore one of the first citizens in Rome who lived his entire life under a republican government, without strong memories of the monarchy. He was in the vanguard of a critical generation. His elders remembered vividly the tyranny of Tarquin, and their steadfast republican principles reflect a personally developed hatred of monarchy. They were the victims and would do anything to avoid being victims again. Cincinnatus, however, and those of his generation, never personally experienced this victimization. Once they came of age, the Republic would have to sink or swim on its own merit. If a would-be tyrant began to acquire too much power, there would be no one to turn to and say, "Hey, remember Tarquin? This guy's trying to be another Tarquin," because there would be no one left who actually remembered Tarquin. It is in this passing from living memory that mistakes of history repeat themselves. Ambitious men of later generations might attempt to seize power, and, believing their times to be unique, a cowering population might allow it. In those times, only vigilance born of a love of republic, not a hatred of monarchy, would save the people from slavery, and Cincinnatus was amongst the first to set down that love of the republic for its own sake. To dispel one myth straight away, Cincinnatus was at no point a defender of the little guy. He was a patrician by birth and upbringing, and when he emerged on the public stage, it was as a steadfast opponent of the tribunes and their reforms. His first appearance in the historical record is not a starring role, but rather a supporting part in the drama of his son Caeso. There was a great deal of civil unrest in the aftermath of Tarentullus' proposal to codify the law, and plebe demonstrations in the forum were often broken up by collections, or gangs if you prefer, of young patrician nobles. Caeso, an abnormally large young man, took to this with great relish, personally beating and chasing any plebe who tried to take part in such demonstrations. Young and hot-tempered that he was, though, he was easy pickings for a savvy tribune named Virginius, who intentionally goaded Caeso by leading provocative public marches that would inevitably draw the wrath of the young man. Once he had enough witnesses and evidence, Virginius brought capital charges against Caeso for, well, all the horrible things he had done. Caeso was ordered to appear at a trial, and if he did not, then he would be fined a large sum of money. It is at this point that Cincinnatus makes his first appearance in the public record, defending his son against Virginius' accusations and asking that the charges be dropped. Rather than face an obviously hostile and biased court, Caeso fled north to Etruria and out of the history of Rome completely. His son having essentially jumped bail, Cincinnatus was forced to sell most of his properties to pay the debt, leaving him a pauper with only a small plot of land on the far side of the Tiber. It is from this impoverished state that Cincinnatus' own legend begins. In 460 BC, not long after the Sabines had been expelled from the citadel, Cincinnatus was chosen to serve as one of the 2 consuls for that year. The tribunes were less than thrilled at this development, recognizing that they had just put the screws to this old man because they were angry with his son, and now he was in a position of authority over them. Cincinnatus did nothing to ease their minds, immediately attacking the character of the plebe leadership, who he accused of aiding and abetting the Sabine capture of the citadel with their selfish myopia. This set the tone for the year. Struggles ensued between the consuls on the one hand, the tribunes on the other, with the Senate and popular assemblies caught in between. Cincinnatus managed to kill Tarentullus' bill for the year, while the tribunes banned the consuls from taking any army more than 1 mile outside the city limits. By the end of the year, no compromise was reached, and the battle was set to continue on into the next year, but the Senate passed a law stating that no magistrate, patrician or plebe, could serve in successive years. The tribunes dismissed this out of hat and had themselves re-elected, so the patricians were set to reconfirm Cincinnatus when he announced that if they were to act no better than the plebes, then they were no better than the plebes, and refused to stand for office. Agreeing reluctantly to this logic, the patricians allowed Cincinnatus to retire to his small farm. It would not be long, however, before he was called back to service in his most famous role, dictator of Rome. In 458, the Aequians had been causing Rome trouble, and one of the consuls for the year was sent with an army to deal with them. However, the fight was much rougher than it had been in the past, and the legions found themselves pinned down, unable to retreat, and facing annihilation. The citizens of Rome panicked, and, without dissent, a dictator was called for, and Cincinnatus was named. A delegation was sent to inform the old man, and famously found him at work on the small farm he had retired to, a living paradigm of Roman virtue. The delegation saluted Cincinnatus as dictator, imploring him to return to the city at once. The tribunes were appalled to see their old political enemy return to such a powerful position, but Cincinnatus was greeted in the city with such acclaim that there was little they could do but hope that the old patrician would not turn his absolute power against them. Cincinnatus, however, was not out to settle political grudges, well, not yet anyway, and promptly raised an army and marched to the rescue of the besieged legion. Wasting no time, Cincinnatus' army swept in and decisively beat the Achaeans, saving the legion and ending the threat. He marched back to Rome and celebrated his well-earned triumph a mere 15 days after being named dictator. Before stepping down, though, Cincinnatus did clear up one bit of family business, forcing Virginius to plead guilty to perjury and go into exile. Rome safe and his family's honor restored, Cincinnatus resigned the dictatorship and returned to his farm, a hero in his own time and a legend thereafter. He would make one final appearance in the public record 20 years later, again appointed as dictator, though this time it was to deal with internal strife and not an external threat. Ironically, it was an attempt by a single man to capture total power in Rome that led to the reappointment of Cincinnatus as dictator. We will talk more next week about the plot of Malleus to make himself king, so for now I will just leave it that a conspiracy was in motion, and Cincinnatus was brought in to deal with it, which he did as quickly as he dispatched the Achaeans, and again resigned the dictatorship and returned to his farm, this time for the last time. Cincinnatus is a bona fide legend, but the particulars of his life are almost certainly an invention. I look forward to the day when I begin covering events from the later, more accurate records, so I don't have to keep saying that the story I've just told you is largely fictitious, but we still have another 50 years before we get to the sack of Rome, so we'll just have to grind through this together. Anyway, the story of Cincinnatus is largely fictitious, but the man was a giant of his age and earned a little mythical embellishment. And regardless of its accuracy, the life of Cincinnatus was handed down from generation to generation and is still told today. His story had a great impact on the Enlightenment-age soldiers of the American Continental Army, who often referred to their great leader, General Washington, as the American Cincinnatus, because at the end of the war he retired rather than allow the people to make him king. When the army was demobilized, the retired officers formed a fraternity of sorts called the Society of the Cincinnati, membership in which was limited to men who had served in the army for 3 years. One of their members was later the territorial governor of Ohio, and he renamed a growing urban hub on the Ohio River Cincinnati, both in honor of the society itself and in honor of Washington, to whom the name originally referred. Ironically, the society still exists today, membership being limited to sons of the original members, making it a hereditary institution, completely anathema to everything the officers had originally been commissioned to fight. But I digress. Cincinnatus' mark had been set upon the world, but what do we make of him? Clearly he was a towering figure in the first century of the Republic, a hero, a consul, twice named dictator. But why the iconic veneration? Allegedly it is for the act of relinquishing absolute power, but we have already seen that Cincinnatus was not the first man to do this, nor would he be the last. The office of dictator was not created especially for him. It was, in fact, a constitutional role that was used regularly in times of crisis. His story, of course, had a nice ring to later Romans, who reveled in his simple homespun virtue, called from his field to save the city. In the good old days, they said, the greatest man of his age was found hard at work on a small farm, not eating figs on a sofa in some palatial estate. He was the epitome of the virtuous farmer-soldier, the ideal Roman. I think two things really contribute to the fame of Cincinnatus. The first is the incidental fact that most people, myself included before I began digging, believe Cincinnatus must have either been the first dictator of Rome or the only dictator of Rome to ever step down voluntarily, or something equally unprecedented. But of course there was nothing particularly unprecedented about Cincinnatus, and our veneration of him in that case would seem to be based upon nothing more than our own misconceptions about Roman history. But even though Cincinnatus wasn't the first or last of anything, he was unique in a profound way. The first two dictators, who, like Cincinnatus, served and then resigned, were men of a generation that remembered the Tarquins, remembered the tyranny, and would not think for a moment about seizing power for themselves so soon after they had thrown out the kings. Cincinnatus, on the other hand, comes from the next generation, a generation that lived their entire lives under the Republic, and was thus the first man who had no memory of monarchy to be given absolute power. The temptation to keep it would not this time be tempered by memories of subjugation and struggle. But the virtue of Cincinnatus returned to the people the power that was rightfully theirs. It was his resignation from dictatorship that really cemented the precedent for later Romans to relinquish dictatorial power and maintain